Welcome, everybody. This is Across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight on geopolitics at the intersection of capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Mark Chandler, Director of Government Relations, Professor of Practice, Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Coastal Carolina University. Mark has served more than 35 years in DoD senior executive, command, and senior leadership positions focused on national security policy, intelligence analysis, application, policy, and operations. Mark retired from the Marine Corps as an intelligence officer after serving around the globe and in multiple crisis environments. He is also retired from the senior executive service ranks in Department of Defense intelligence and security policy arenas. Mark has held a variety of key positions, including Deputy J2 Joint Chiefs of Staff, Director of Defense Intelligence Agency's Middle East and Africa Center, Director of Warfighter Support for Office of Secretary of Defense, Intelligence, Director of Intelligence Analysis and Partnerships and Engagements for the U.S. Air Force. Mark holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and an MS in International Relations from Troy University. He continues to write on issues affecting U.S. intelligence observations, national policy concerns, and leadership. Mark, really appreciate you hopping on this morning. I know you're a busy guy with a busy schedule, so thank you for your time.
Garrett, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me and being willing to talk about some of these important issues.
Absolutely. So we'll just get right into it, Mark. I went through your background here, of course, very extensive. You have a lot of very good, and I think really helpful context to help folks, be able to explain and understand what's going on. So if you want to just dive into that, I'd be interested personally to hear your background, Mark, in the Marine Corps intelligence officer, where around the globe you served. It was mentioned multiple crisis environments, work at the DoD as well. So keep it open-ended, but, like to hear about your background.
All right, Garrett, I'm not too comfortable talking much about myself, but
Sure.
I think, where I am today was shaped a lot by those experiences you talked about. In the Marine Corps, I didn't join to spend 21 years in the Marine Corps. I joined to serve my country. I felt I owed it to my country, so I did that. And then I would say I got lucky. I was fortunate to serve under some great leaders, and then take what we were doing for our nation forward. I was in Desert Shield, Desert Storm as a young captain. That was a tremendous experience, a learning experience about leadership, about how governments interact, about the use of the military. So I just kind of kept stumbling forward, if you will, and continued to go. I was involved in the initial invasion of Iraq, helped plan that in 2003, and then I would call it fortunate enough to be able to serve and go all the way to Baghdad. So I think those were the highlights of some of the aspects of my Marine Corps career in serving around the globe. I participated in some non-combatant evacuations of U.S. citizens. We could be facing that today in the Middle East. So in understanding that we were there, where we were an extension of our national power, if you will, and diplomacy, I learned a great deal. I also learned through great leaders that I had. So that experience in the Marine Corps helped shape who I became later on and how I look at the world and even domestic and international politics. I was very fortunate to serve in Department of Defense intelligence, some of those key positions. You mentioned the Deputy J2 of the Joint Chiefs. That was a phenomenal experience. I would say outside of combat intelligence, that was some of my most challenging times from 2012 to 2015 when I served as DJ2. Right there, advising the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs on our national policy and what was happening so they could give the President the best military advice. And I learned a great deal. That was like a PhD in military science and in international relations all rolled into one. And then I was able to expand from that learning and go on to DIA. And then in the Air Force, my last job in the Air Force helped revitalize intelligence analysis for the Air Force, kind of refocus that. So great experience, great people, great leaders that helped shape me and my understanding of how I see the world today and how I do that with Coastal Carolina and our intelligence students. I'm not a PhD. I'm just a poor kid from Alabama. So, that learning I brought from real world experience is what I try to piece together the academic part of what the students have to what reality is that they're going to face when they step into a possible career in intelligence.
Fantastic. Yeah. And again, incredibly extensive background. When I first learned about you, Mark, I was, I think, kind of awestruck just at all the different roles that you had played, the DoD, intelligence, and otherwise, in the Marines as well. So that's fantastic, and really appreciate you expanding and just like elaborating on where that real life experience comes from. Again, I think it's super helpful to contextualize your background and the insights that you give based off of that. So, moving into some of the topics we want to talk about today with you, Mark, I'll do a bit of scene setting at first on the current geopolitical landscape. And I don't think any of this is going to be particularly new to you, just given your background. I know you study a lot of this, but to jump around the map for a brief moment, elections happening in South America. Venezuela is in the news a lot right now. Maduro, so there's hotspots just south of our own border. Of course, there you jump to the Middle East. You start talking about Iran and Israel's conflict with Gaza and Hamas. Then you jump even further to Europe. You're talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine that is still ongoing, a few years in the making at this point, with at least right now no real end in sight. Then you jump a little bit further to the east. You talk about conflict areas and areas of potential kinetic conflicts, like obviously China. So, really quick and brief summary. Obviously, we'll get into some of these topics more in depth. But just at a super high level, what are your thoughts on the current geopolitical landscape as it stands today? Again, I just provided the high level brief overview, but if there's anything I missed, I'd be interested to know. So, your thoughts on the landscape today geopolitically, and what do you worry most about currently as major national security issues facing the United States?
Well, I think when you bounced around the globe there, you kind of gave the picture of what the United States faces. We are the most powerful nation on earth. And I say that there's this thing called DIME, DIME, diplomatic, information, military, and economic. Those are how nations are evaluated in their strength against one another. So I think when you look holistically, that's the United States. We're preeminent in that. However, we have challengers that want to knock us off.
Right.
And so you went around the globe and you looked at South America, Venezuela, the situation down there. It's more than just Venezuela that could be a challenge to stability in our hemisphere. But then you go to the Middle East and you look at the challenges we're facing there, the threats to energy, the threats to democracy in the Middle East that not only threaten the United States economically, but could drag us down militarily, and then our allies that are tied in with the Middle East and Europe. So we have those ties there. You look at what Russia's doing in Ukraine. You look at the constant threat that China has against Taiwan, but not just Taiwan. You look at the entire southern and Southeast Asian area, and China is striving for preeminent power in that area, control, with the exclusion of the United States. So what do I fear? I fear all of that challenging us at one time and a lack of strategic vision in our leadership. And so we need to look across all those elements of national power and realize where the challenges lie. And it may not be in any one of those particular areas. It could be a combination of the two. What do I fear the most? I fear the most of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea all kind of coalescing, maybe not in a true traditional coalition sense, but coalescing around wanting to knock the United States off the pedestal, if you will.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Definitely a topic I want to dive into for sure, and how states like you mentioned, Russia and China, are doing a bit of, and maybe more than just a bit, but loose coalition building anti-Western coalition building to, and this is a phrase that's been used in a few different publications, called the axis of upheaval. And that includes different states that you just mentioned: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Now, while these states, and this is just a tangent at this point, but while these states have, maybe differing strategic interests, ultimately, at least in the short term, it feels as if they are aligned. So, as an aside, but I think that you bring up a fantastic and really good point there, Mark. So, talking about national security, what are your thoughts on what the United States gets right on our own national security policy? What do we get wrong on our own national security policy? And then what are our potential blind spots? So you had mentioned, I think one of your biggest fears is those different actors coming together and working together in tandem, at least in the short term, to overturn or, form some sort of upheaval against a Western or democratic-led global order. But I think just getting more granular in a changing environment, is the U.S.'s national security policy up to snuff to meet the challenges of a changing environment? So bringing it back down, Mark, I know I just threw a lot at you. What does the U.S. get right on national security? What do we get wrong, and any blind spots that you see?
Well, let me start with the blind spots. And I
Yeah.
think this kind of runs, it ebbs and flows depending on administrations and the challenges we face domestically. But sometimes when we turn inward, and we do have to be concerned with our domestic situation, our domestic economy and that. But we have to also realize how interconnected we are internationally, especially economically. So one of the biggest problems we have, and I think it's inherent in the current times, is a lack of strategic understanding of the world. So when you look at that, if I want to take on Russia and what it's doing against Ukraine, I can't ignore China and what it's doing in the South China Seas against Taiwan and any loose coalition it could be building, say, with North Korea. So there's a common factor among those adversaries you mentioned. And that common factor is they all have one number one enemy, and that's the United States. Our failure to appreciate the nuance and understanding what the enemy of my enemy might drive them together to do against the United States, I think we failed to pick up on that. And there's two schools of thought that are kind of prevalent in international relations. And they've been around for decades, right? If not hundreds of years, basically breaking it down. That's realism versus liberalism. Not liberalism as in the Democratic Party, but
Right.
but a school of thought that was penned decades and decades ago. So you look at that, liberalism wants to work through international organizations. They want to work through the belief that peace can be achieved through diplomacy,
Right.
through cooperation. Realist,
Multilateralism.
exactly. Realist, on the other hand, that they start to see that there is a natural conflict out there, and they need to have strong power. So I go back to Dime, a strong power base in which to face those challenges. I hate to say this, but history has
Right.
proven out that realism is more the case in historic settings. Personally, I like diplomacy. And having been in the Marine Corps, having been, at the forefront of when diplomacy fails, we have to take military action. I don't want to go to war, but we have to be prepared for that and realize that once diplomacy fails, we have to have strength. And so that's the other thing about getting it wrong that you asked me about.
Yeah.
We have to have a strong military to back up our diplomatic efforts. Without that, we will lose face. We will lose our strength on a global scale. And we also have to have a strong economy and understand, where the challenges are in that. So it is back to Dime. I hate to bring it back to that,
No,
but
yeah.
we fail, I think, to understand the strategic picture and the strategic challenges. I'm going to look out in any administration 1 year or the next election cycle, but really our enemies are playing the long game. What's going to happen post this administration or challenge in the next administration or what policies are set. We have to be prepared for that longer look, and we're a little bit short on that strategic approach.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. And I think that that is something that you bring up a few interesting points in there, Mark. I think, where does U.S. current national security policy stand, and are we being stale, like you said, I think, to meet some of these different challenges? And the big point I think you made there, at least that caught my attention, is this disparity in, of course, we all want peace. Nobody really wants to go to war. But are we doing the right things to make that happen? And the word that comes to mind when we're talking about all of this is deterrence, right? And so a piece that I just saw recently, I think it's a committee in the House of Representatives, the Select Committee on the CCP. They actually put together a summary report, and I think they get a lot of classified intelligence to put together this report. But their findings essentially said, in a world where China, Russia, North Korea, Iran are working at least somewhat in tandem and together, the United States can't compete with that grouping alone, right? And so I think it's really interesting. So we're thinking strategically differently as we enter this new environment in the 21st century, this new security environment in the 21st century, and how we think about incorporating U.S. allies in regional security. I think is a really interesting question there. As an aside, I think Germany, as of this past week, was talking with the Philippines, or agreeing to sign a security pact, at least by the end of the year. And right off the bat, that seems kind of interesting, right? Why is Germany so far away in another continent talking to the Philippines about, signing a security agreement? And I think this facelift of U.S. national security policy and incorporating more U.S. allies, this action by the Philippines and Germany is probably an outgrowth of that change in strategy, right? And that we cannot compete alone, but it's going to take a group effort of, like I said, liberal democracies, as you mentioned, which is super interesting.
No, you're absolutely right on that.
Mm-hmm.
We do have to have allies. I mean, while we are strong, we are extended.
Yeah.
The challenges are extended. So we have to, wherever those regions are, Europe, the Pacific, we have to go in with coalitions and build those early and build them strong.
Yeah, and I think that's another great point, right? And so you mentioned being stretched. And this comes back to, makes me think about some of the current topics that are going on around the globe right now. And this is, I know, Mark, your area of expertise in the Middle East and Africa, right? I think the amount of naval assets that we have in the Middle East currently, as it stands today, as we're talking on 8/7/2024 on a Wednesday, is staggering, right? And at the same time, of course, that's not the only conflict that's happening around the world, right? So to use the same phrasing, it's, we feel stretched militarily. We can't be everywhere. We can't be everywhere at once.
No,
that's to say,
absolutely.
Which is kind of scary to think about, just given the staggering amount of conflicts around the world that are currently underway. But to bring it into, again, Mark, your area of focus, so the Middle East. Let's talk about Israel. Let's talk about Iran. I think if you could just give a brief overview of the current conflict, and where it all started and kicked off back in October between Israel and Hamas, and then where we are today on the eve of a likely Iranian strike on Israel. I mean, this could probably happen any moment. I know you and I talked about this before hopping on this call today. So we'd love to get your, in-depth expertise and knowledge there.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, Garrett. One thing, if I could, you said a key word, and I want to talk about that for just a brief moment, and that's deterrence.
Yep.
Deterrence is key if you're going to continue to push forward and have power and avoid, somebody doing something against your will, somebody trying to impose their will on you. You got to have three elements for deterrence. You have to have the military capability, right? Second, you have to have the will to use that in a manner you say you're going to use it in your best interest. And third, your adversary must understand that you have the will. They recognize you have the capability, but they must believe you have the will to use it. And that will then play into part of my answer on the Middle East situation right now. Starting on October 7th last year, Hamas came across with a phenomenal surprise attack against Israel. I mean, and there has been and now that we've gone forward almost 10 months, you can see where intelligence failed to pick up some things. And that's based on commenting. I'm going to teach that this fall. We'll talk about that. But
Right.
when you look at that, that overwhelming attack by Hamas against Israel, the slaughter, the capturing of the civilians, the hostages taken in there, was phenomenal, shocked everybody. And then you've seen Israel's massive response to that, going out there trying to take out Hamas. The problem with what Israel has faced, and a little bit, and I've been critical of this in some of these interviews you talked about, is, the civilian apparatus in any government gives the military its direction, its guidance, and its missions. We in the military then follow that. Netanyahu said, we're going to destroy Hamas. Well, that word destroy in military terms means something to us. And so that means I'm going to eradicate it, eliminate its fighting capability, its command structure completely. That is one of the hardest missions a military can undertake, to destroy something. I can destroy a building with a bomb.
Right.
I take it to rubble, but I don't know if I can destroy an idea or a terrorist organization.
Yep.
So that's the challenge that Israel has faced. And then you've seen this fighting for 10 months as really Hamas has focused on, as a terrorist organization, fighting like terrorists. And those are some of the most difficult adversaries to face. We're still fighting Al-Qaeda. It's, what is it, 23 years since we attacked in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is still in existence for the last 10 years, and we still have troops in Iraq and Syria fighting ISIS. So it's very hard to destroy or eliminate a terrorist ideology or a terrorist fighting structure. That's what Israel's been trying to do. But Iran has been behind the Hamas, the Hezbollah, and the Houthi attack. Just real quick on Iran. They want to establish what is called the Shia crescent across the Middle East.
Yeah.
That's where Shia, led by Iran, the Shia faction of Islam, wants to control everything that happens in the Middle East. Two primary adversaries to Iran are Israel and the United States. But Iran is fighting what we call a proxy war. It's using Hamas, it's using Hezbollah, it's using the Houthis, and it's using really a lot of what I call Iranian-backed Shia militia in Iraq and Syria. So the constant pressure on Israel and the constant pressure on the United States. We just had a United States base attacked 2 days ago.
Yep.
By these Iranian-backed Shia militias. So you look at that, and that's the challenge strategically that Israel faces while fighting a tactical conflict in Gaza. And I don't know when it's going to end, and Hamas will not be technically eliminated, but while facing what's going on with Hezbollah. So what Israel's done is turn to deterrence. And so right now, we're kind of on the precipice of a wide-scale Middle Eastern war. But Israel's actions by taking out Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, and then the number one military commander for Hezbollah in Beirut. So when you look at that, those are very bold moves, but it sends a message that, that I can reach out and attack you in your sovereign territory in Tehran, and I can penetrate your defenses in some way to go after leadership. That's a bold move, and it says I have the will to do it. And then the same thing with Hezbollah, because Israel and Hezbollah for almost 10 months have been trading blows back and forth. Some rockets, some attack UAVs, and then I'm going to drop bombs in Lebanon. So it's back and forth. But Israel may have stopped the escalation by attacking those two key individuals and sending that message to a bigger Hezbollah and obviously Iran. They may have stopped escalation. They haven't stopped the fight. I firmly believe Iran's going to come back. They have to. It's part of the culture that Iran and Hezbollah follow. So they will strike back in some message in some way. But will they take it to the step where they know Israel will come back and go after the regime, go after, say, downtown Tehran or some of the key components of Iranian power or Hezbollah power. That's that's going to be determined by what we see over the next few days from Hezbollah and Iran.
Right. And like you said, I think their hands are tied, and I say they being Iran, their hands are almost tied in that they have to respond, as you just said. It's kind of embarrassing for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard if, again, as you mentioned, Israel is able to eliminate these targets within their own sovereign territory, particularly within their own capital of Tehran. That's kind of an embarrassment. So just to basically at a safe face level, you almost have to respond. And the thing that I find interesting about this is we've been here before, just in the past year or so, right? I think it was a few months ago. I'm not going to get this totally correct, but we were in the same cycle of Iran or Israel. Iran makes a strike, one or the other has to respond. And at the time, it was a large missile barrage coming from Iran to Israel. So not using any proxies, but direct from Iran to Israel, which is pretty significant. But at the time, they were saying similar messaging as they're saying now, in that, look, guys, in the broader world, we have to respond, but we don't want to escalate. We don't want to push this further. Because they realistically know that there's nothing to really be gained from a direct conflict, I think, and so it seems like almost political theater. Now, I say political theater. This obviously has real world and material implications. People die, right? Particularly in this region, as you mentioned. In part of that response, that's anticipated to be a multi-stage response, is the latest I'm hearing from
Mhm.
Iran. U.S. bases have been struck, and so U.S. service members have been struck. And I'm not sure if that was planned or intentional by Iran, but that seems like an escalation, right? So it's not only we're going to hit back against Israel, but the United States as well in Iraq. Which I don't know. I'd be curious to see. I mean, do you believe that was intentional? That almost seems like it would be very escalatory, which is opposed to what Iran said that they want to do. They want to respond, but not escalate.
Well, I think when we look at attack on U.S. forces, that was one of the scenarios, in the multiple courses of action I believe Iran has attacking U.S. forces because they lump the U.S. in the same category as Israel. During the inauguration of the new Iranian president, the
Yep.
chants were death to Israel and death to America.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. These Iranian-backed Shia militia, they want two objectives. One, they are going to follow, for the most part, Iran's guidance, but they also want the U.S. forces out of Iraq and out of Syria. So I think there was a little bit of messaging from Iran to tell them to do this. Maybe they overplayed their hands, and so we'll see. But I do think it's part of trying to keep the U.S., keep Israel off balance. We've seen several attacks from Hezbollah. They haven't let up, but it hasn't been an overwhelming response at this time. Let me go back to the deterrence statement. The U.S. now should actually make a deterrence message, if you will, by force, that is not acceptable to attack U.S. forces in Iraq, in Syria, and strike back at key Iranian-backed Shia militia and send that message, or an IRGC element. That's going to help deter further attacks on that.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. No, that's, I think, super helpful and insightful. Um, and I want to also get your thoughts here, Mark, too. So we're obviously talking about Israel and Iran and its proxies in the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like. But I'm also curious, during your time in the region and studying the region, crafting policy for the U.S. Specifically for that region, what role, if any, do you believe Saudi Arabia plays here? And I'll give you some context just based off the knowledge that I know and have. Saudi Arabia was proposed to have some sort of normalization of ties, some other Gulf states, some normalization of ties with Israel. Now, of course, you mentioned the type of Islam that Iran follows. Saudi Arabia follows a different type of subclass, and you could probably explain this further for me. I'm sure I'm butchering it, but a subclass of the religion, right? And I think it's Wahhabism, if I'm not
Yep.
mistaken. But nonetheless, they are not religiously aligned, at least. Now, as that war rages on, the Israel Hamas conflict rages on, I think that normalization ties have been stalled, which is interesting. And at the same time, and this happened, I think, a few months ago, the U.S. has floated under Joe Biden has floated a proposed Saudi-U.S. security pact. Now, this is kind of like a separate story, but I think that pact is meant to do a few different things. One, bring them more in the orbit of the West. I think some stipulations of that agreement also say that China can't build any military bases in the country. So it's looking to do a myriad of things, but as well as to counter Iran. So in bringing it back to the conversation that we're talking about. So given all that background, do you believe that Saudi Arabia or Gulf states have a role to play here in countering Iran? Are they kind of neutral actors? Are they working with the U.S. and Israel? Your insight would be awesome.
Garrett, part of that broke up, so if I don't touch on specifically what you asked, let me know.
I'll let you know. Yeah.
Okay, but looking at, Saudi Arabia is a key nation. They're a key nation in the Middle East because a lot of the Arab states look up to them and follow their lead, primarily for one thing, economy. All right. So when you look at that, you look at oil driving kind of the global economy, and things kind of cascade downward from what Saudi Arabia has and the power it has through that. That's where they're a key element. You hit the nuances of Islam correctly. They're Shia, Sunni, and then you can start to get extreme to the Wahhabis, excuse me, the Wahhabi sect. And so you start to look at how that breaks out. There's traditional animosity since the overthrow of the Shah in 1979 between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yep.
Because the Iranian ruling mullahs want to spread that Shia crescent. Predominantly, you've got a lot of Sunnis in Saudi Arabia, plus you have the oil. So they want to maintain and continue to push that. They like that. Now, that's critical. The U.S. military pact with Saudi Arabia is vital. We've long cooperated militarily. We've supported them. I don't want to go into details about some of the things we have with Saudi Arabia, but they're key to us being able to project power into the Middle East. So we have to maintain that. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that China is trying to establish a stronger footprint in the Middle East.
Yep.
And they went so far as a year ago to create a pact is too strong a word, but cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They were the first that got the two nations to talk in a diplomatic, positive realm. Nothing's happened since then, but it helped China play well to kind of look like an international broker, if you will.
Yeah.
Our goal is to keep China out of our allied regions. They've got this Belt and Road Initiative that they push all over the globe, and they try to put their foot and insert themselves militarily wherever they can. And so that's a challenge. That's what this pact will do. The Abraham Accords from the last administration helped start to bridge the historic animosity between Israel and the Arab states. So that helped out. While I think we're kind of strategically paused right now with the Israel-Saudi Arabia agreement, I think you are going to see that start to move forward. As kind of the keeper of the Arab ideals and the leader of the Arab states, you look at Saudi Arabia, they can't cooperate too much with Israel publicly until there's some sort of resolution to the Hamas-Israel conflict. But you'll note that there is still some support behind the scenes. There's a lot of talking with Israel behind the scenes because it benefits no one in the Middle East except Iran to go to war, to have that conflict. So I think we're going to continue to progress that way. It's just the situation, the dynamics at play right now are going to take us that way.
Yeah. And from everything I've read, again, that kind of corroborates what you're saying here, Mark, is that at least publicly, this can't really go through. It's kind of table stakes, the conflict between the Israelis and Hamas in Gaza. has to end first before there can be any big public showing of support. At least, I'm sure privately the Saudis would like to, normalize ties, deepen economic ties, deepen military ties in counter of Iran. There's, I think, no love lost between Saudis and Iran. So I think that in the future, I think you're probably right. I would bet on seeing that, but this conflict has to end first.
It
Now,
does.
to wrap up the area that we're in here, Mark, how do you see the conflict coming to an end? If you could look into your crystal ball, a lot of moving parts, and I'm sure by the time that this is published, Iran will have made a move, changing yet another factor in this equation. But how do you see it coming to an end? When do you see it coming to an end? And then we can hop to China.
Well, first, I don't know when it's going to end. That's one thing I'll tell my students. That's one thing I'll tell a policymaker, a commander. I don't know is a valid answer in this case. And I think there are
Yeah.
so many dynamics at play. So whenever this interview and this discussion is published and we start to look at that, how the escalation goes after an Iranian strike and a Hezbollah strike depends on how wide scale and how much damage and civilian deaths they cause in Israel. That will be the determining factor in does this escalate or not. The next thing I think is how far Hamas wants to continue to take this. There's a lot of pressure on Israel to reach a ceasefire agreement. They put so many on the table. The one common denominator in not having a ceasefire is Hamas. They turned that down. And now they just appointed Sinwar, the one who was the orchestrator behind the October 7th attacks,
Yeah.
as the leader of Hamas. I think that's not going to bode well
Sends a
for
message for sure.
it does. And it's not going to be a good thing for positive negotiations. So unfortunately, I think it's going to drag on. Even when there's a ceasefire, you're going to see conflict because Hamas will not completely surrender. So you look at that, and I think you're going to see a situation where Israel has to maintain a security force. We've been on the precipice of war. We've had the 67 war, open warfare, the 73 Yom Kippur war that happened in the Middle East. I don't know if we'll escalate to that level unless in the next couple of days, Iran takes it there. So we may have enough deterrent factors in place to kind of stall that off. And even though hope is not a course of action, that's
Right.
something I hope. And there's one other thing I need to mention that's an outlier that would change all the dynamics of which I'm talking about, and that's
Okay.
Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
If Iran had a nuclear weapon at this time, the whole situation and deterrence value would be completely different. And that's another factor going back to answer your Saudi Arabia US agreement. That's one thing no Arab state wants to see Iran achieve, much less we don't want to see it. Israel certainly doesn't. So that's a wild card that strategically speaking, we need to keep in the back of our minds moving forward over the years. So
Okay. Yeah. No, and like you said, I think the nuclear card, to just touch on it super briefly, does kind of flip the table a little bit and everything that we're talking about. So just kind of you would have to reevaluate almost everything strategically, especially, and this is all from the perspective of the United States. But okay, that's fantastic, Mark. Thank you so much. So we mentioned China, right? And I think you're absolutely right in that they love to play or would like to be perceived as being a global deal maker, peacemaker. You mentioned the broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think that was very interesting. There's also a lot of parallels and juxtapositions you can make to Clinton doing the same thing a few decades ago. There's a picture, you can Google it online. It's almost identical, which is crazy to see. Nonetheless, China in the South, well, I say South China Sea, really the Indo-Pacific. That's how I like to refer to as, and Taiwan. Mark, what are your thoughts on what realistic threat or realistic risk China poses to the United States? There's obviously a lot of talk about it, but what do you see as noise versus what's real? So what realistic threat, if any, does China pose to strategic interests of the United States? And what are your thoughts on if China will actually invade Taiwan? This is another big question mark, of course. And I think we can get into it in a second, but obviously so many different ramifications militarily, politically, economically, if China were to actually try to and attempt to invade Taiwan. But we'll bring it back to the top. What realistic challenge do you believe China poses to strategic U.S. interests?
I think China probably poses the number one challenge to our strategic interests, whether it's economic or military, if you look at that. And I go back to Dime and we look at the national power. China has integrated itself across the globe economically. And then you look at the economic relationship between the US and China, our import imbalance, if you will, at least from my perspective, a non-economist perspective, looking at the imbalance that we have on imports versus exports. China's in a very strong position in that regard. And so in the pandemic, proved that out a lot when you started to see how the supply chain was interrupted just through a pandemic. Now imagine doing that as an extension of your national power. So China holds a lot of cards. China, as I observed through the end of my career and transition since then, I still follow China very closely and what it's doing. They have incrementally, this is 2024, so at least for the last 15 years, been building a military capability to go against one adversary, and that's the United States. They have slowly built up their air forces, their missile forces, and their naval forces. So they changed the command structures of how they've oriented and focused their militaries into regional commands, much like we have, but focused against Taiwan, against where the United States would have to attack, coming from the Pacific region or coming, say, from the South China Sea. They have watched us fight wars. They've watched us since Desert Storm. They've watched us since before that. They know how the United States will fight. They know that we are, as I would say, playing an away game. China's playing an internal game where their supplies, their military forces are all on their home field. We have to push power forward. That's why those alliances you mentioned earlier are so critical. How do we base there? How do we move in securely? So China's focus has been to not invade the United States, but deter the United States from interfering in what China believes is its sovereign right. They believe Taiwan is part of China. It's not, but they believe that it is. They believe the South China Sea is part of its own territory. It is not. You've got 5 Southeast Asian nations all competing with claims over the South China Sea.
Yeah.
But China's actually militarized that. What used to be a small atoll or a reef at low tide, they put military bases all throughout the South China Sea to push power forward. So that's what they've established, kind of pushing what in ancient times is the Middle Kingdom out in south and southeast, and then preparing to stop the United States from interfering in what China assesses is its cultural, historic, and military and diplomatic rights.
Yeah, and you bring up a few interesting points there, Mark, and I'll start with military and how they're building it specifically with the United States in mind to counter what we have hardware-wise. And the thing about this that I often think of is our aircraft carriers. For the past few decades, and especially after World War II, U.S. power projection, military power projection, came from aircraft carriers, right? And in response to that, what's China done to counter that? They've built a lot of submarines, aircraft killers, right? So that's just one specific example of the broader point you bring up, in that they're building a military specifically to counter the United States. The other piece of this, and we chatted a little bit about this prior, they being China is a net importer of energy. So what happens if they do go for it? They do try to invade Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Well, the United States will bring in a lot of its military assets, a lot of those aircraft carriers that I mentioned just now, that would effectively cut off about 1/3 of the globe's trade that happens in the Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, however you want to refer to it. They would be cut off from their energy imports. And what are they doing in response to that? China is one of the largest builders of nuclear power plants today. They also burn a lot of coal. They're getting it now more of it from Russia. But I think a lot of these moves are to insulate themselves from any big blowbacks that would happen from that, to essentially, where they're thinking, where are we going to get our energy from if we do and try to invade Taiwan. So two things there that I think are really big. And I'll draw you out on this a little bit, Mark. So we talked about this for sure prior to a call, but do you think that they'll actually do it? I mentioned when we were chatting that it will probably, I believe that if it doesn't happen in the next 5 years, it's not going to happen at all. China seems to be at the apex of their power right now, economically, militarily, population-wise. And I think if it does not happen after these 5 years, you see a pretty precipitous decline in Chinese power, whether that's economic, military. Again, their population's rapidly declining. But, what do you think are the actual realistic chances that China actually, tries to go for it and invades their neighbor, Taiwan?
Yeah, Garrett, that's excellent insight. You should do this for a living. So I'll put it to you like this. I went through the military buildup that China has undergone for over a decade to counter the United States. You touched on some key factors of insulating China itself against any kind of counter U.S. action to an aggressive Chinese move. Energy is critical. Trade is obviously critical. The Chinese economy is not doing well right now. So you start to look at those factors. So while you might see things point against that, there's a wild card aspect to this. And that wild card is President Xi. He is serving. He thinks he's the be all end all for Chinese culture. He wants to ensure he leaves a legacy, and that legacy is tarnished by the existence of Taiwan. And so while it may not make economic sense, they may not be militarily ready for Xi, and this is where we have to enter, and I talk to my students a lot about this. It's something I believe we don't appreciate enough, are human dynamics. It's a communist society. So what he ultimately decides he wants to leave, he being Xi, right, then we start to look at the wild card of, does China take action? It's not a democratic society where they can elect a new administration that goes toward peace. They're going to continue down this path. And I think they're set on a path of taking over Taiwan. But what does that look like? I'm military. I think a lot about that, but they could do that without firing a shot. I mean, when you look at this, I could isolate Taiwan purely with a naval blockade. They have the naval power to go in there and completely cut off Taiwan without firing a shot. So what's the West response? What's the U.S. response? Are we going to go start seeking Chinese ships? Are we going to attack the Chinese mainland because they've done this blockade? And so then it puts us in a strategic quandary challenge that we have to face. Now, they have a missile force that is unequaled in the world. They could drop missiles across Taiwan. They could invade it with forces, drop bombs on it. They could do everything they want, but then that takes away some of the economic gain they would get out of, say the microchip industry that's located there. So you have to look at those aspects that all go into making a decision. Now, let me just throw my ideas out, because the one thing we can't do is mirror image. And so that's a lot of problems that we have in the Western mindset. This doesn't make sense because I wouldn't do that. So we have to try to understand what China wants, what Xi wants, and how they're going to go about and do it. But the United States needs to be prepared for all possible scenarios. One could be not firing a single shot and just blockading it with the hundreds of surface ships that they have, and the ability to launch some of those missiles that I've talked about are designed for one thing and one thing only: to take out our aircraft carriers before they can ever get into range of launching the air power we have that makes the United States so strong.
Fantastic. So it sounds like maybe is the answer. Maybe they'll invade.
Well, as any good intel officer, I'm gonna kind of hedge my bets. But no,
Please, yeah, yeah.
I think we're in a window. You talked about 5 years. They may or may not do it. I'm going to go with you. I think we're in a 5-year window. We're already past some of the projections that when I worked in the Defense Department that where we had and started to work on this. So I think when we look at that, we're in a window. We're in a very vulnerable window right now against Chinese aggression against Taiwan.
Yeah. Okay. I would totally agree. So Mark, I'm looking at the clock here. I want to be cognizant of your time. Again, I know you have a busy schedule. So really quickly, want to touch on your thoughts on whether or not we are currently in a Cold War. A lot of headlines you've seen currently. Look at Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, wherever you get your news. It's often coined Cold War V2, right? And I think that's a very little funny coinage of the term, but I think a big defining factor of the first Cold War was competing ideologies for a
Yes.
global system, right? And I think in very much in the same way as today, actors like we talked about this before, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, while they may have differences in their strategic goals, they have what seems to be a shared interest in overturning the current liberal democratic-led global order. And so again, I see parallels from the Cold War of yesterday to what is currently going on today. I'm probably of the belief that yes, we are in a Cold War currently, which I think a lot of Americans have not come to peace with. And we probably do, as a country, need to come to peace with, look, there's a lot at stake here. So that is the background. Mark, do you think that we're in a Cold War? And do we not? How do you define a Cold War? Am I wrong on that? I'm curious on your thoughts there.
Well, I can pick up any edition of Foreign Affairs or any kind of publication and give you 5 different definitions of a Cold War. But I like how you characterized it and framed it, and that is, a competition between 2 ideologies for global supremacy.
Right.
So we're essentially at economic ideologies right now for economic supremacy. And by an extension of that, we are facing military challenges. So during the original Cold War, you saw a lot of proxy wars with militaries. We were fighting, in Central America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and the Soviet Union back then, or the Chinese would send their forces, their proxy forces, and train them, and we would do the same. What we haven't seen in this case is an extension like that militarily. So the Middle East fight isn't really an extension of that, but it could allow those adversaries to take advantage of that. But where I think we're seeing kind of the Cold War challenges, if you will, and that is economically. You're starting to see how economics are playing and the information warfare. A lot of people underappreciate the misinformation and disinformation campaign that China and Russia are both pushing very hard to destabilize us domestically, but also interfere with our allies. So I don't see a kinetic Cold War. We had that, and mutual assured destruction of nuclear annihilation on both sides kept us from that. But I do see an information warfare that's taking place below the surface. I see an economic warfare that's taking place below the surface. And we as Americans do need to wake up for that. I love the fact that we've got an East Coast and a West Coast, and we are protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. But our interests do reside overseas. We have to take care of ourselves domestically, but our economic interests lie with allies. And the biggest mistake that the U.S. has had, and it's proven out over centuries, is we get comfortable and we focus so much internally and we isolate ourselves that we fail to recognize the international impacts on us. And I just think we as Americans need to, yes, let's solve our domestic issues. Let's get through what's taking place now. But we must keep a strategic eye on the international world. It's there. And there are people who don't like us, unfortunately, more than we want to appreciate. So that's something that we have to maintain, and that's look external while taking care of ourselves. Unfortunately, we don't do it enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I'll leave it there, but I think it's very cyclical. See these same kind of cycles happen. Isolation is tinges, I guess I'll call them. World War One, World War Two,
Yes.
inevitably draws the U.S. back to be involved in the world. So anyway, looking at the clock here, Mark, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and this morning. Really appreciate it. Before we hop, where can folks find you? What are you working on that is new? What's going on with Mark Chandler? Tell us about it.
Well, Garrett, I appreciate that. And, this has been a great talk. I love talking about this stuff.
Same. We could
And
do it
trying
all
to,
afternoon.
I could. I mean,
Yeah.
this is great. So I should bring you to my class and have you force my students to listen to this. But what we're starting the fall semester here in a couple of weeks, so we're getting ready for that. Personally, what I'm looking at is
Yep.
this kind of conversation. I want to spread this information. I've done almost 50 interviews on the Israel-Hamas war, and one of the feedback I get from viewers is you helped explain it. So I want to try to help make the complex comprehensible. I want to try not simple because the world is so complex, but I want to try to maybe start a podcast, maybe get some things written out there so that I can help Americans understand the challenges that we face and maybe give them in a more comprehensible way what's happening in the world and how that affects us. So I want to start doing that, maybe reach out a little bit on consulting. I'm an old guy, so got to figure out this computer stuff and how to put some things down out there. But that's where I'd like to go, Garrett. And I appreciate the time that we've had today.
Likewise. And like you said, I could do this all afternoon. I know you could definitely do this all afternoon, Mark. So we'll have to have you on again. This was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Everybody go look at the links below on where you can find Mark and look out for new stuff that is going to be coming out from him. Fantastic guy with a lot of different knowledge and skill sets. So please follow the links below. Check him out. Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate the time this afternoon.
Thank you, Garrett. My pleasure.